Gentleman deny that he telegraphed that he would be here and support the government after he knew everything about the Canadian Pacific Railway affair? Does he deny that?
I do deny it. I never telegraphed that I would be here and support the government. Never, never. I know the right honourable gentleman wrote me asking me to come down.
I'll tell you! He dare not listen to an explanation!
I said I could not support the government. But I offered and proposed that the government...
After almost 5 years of Liberal government, the smoldering bitterness over the Pacific scandal finally exploded in the Canadian House of Commons. John A. Macdonald's Tories grabbed a chance to lambaste the independent member who'd refused to support them when they fell from power in 1873, Donald Smith.
I dare to state that I ever said I could support him.
Now, with the traditional message from the Senate, Parliament was about to be dissolved to make way for an election. But neither Macdonald nor his ally Charles Tupper was paying any attention to parliamentary ritual.
There is not one single word of truth in that statement. Not one single word.
The honourable gentleman says he did not say so. Certainly the spirit within him said it, for the words came out of the gentleman's mouth.
Mr. Speaker, a message from His Excellency, the Governor-General.
I have never witnessed such cowardly...
I have very much pleasure in informing the House that it
He knows.
will receive the messenger.
You are the coward. Hey, Father, there were 2 gentlemen, members of this House, who came to me with a proposition to throw over the right honourable gentleman if I would consent to support the government.
Me! Treacherous coward!
Who is the coward? This House will decide it.
His Excellency, the
yourself.
Governor-General desires the immediate attendance of this honourable House in the Senate chamber.
That fellow Smith is the biggest liar I ever met.
Too much juice for you.
Stop it, John! Get a hold of you!
I could lick him quicker than hell could scorch a feather.
And yet, that fellow Smith would become one of the principal backers of Macdonald's railroad. And what's more, 7 years later, he'd be given the honor of driving the last spike. That was one of the wildest scenes in the whole history of the Canadian House of Commons. But it actually happened. The date was Friday, May 10th, 1878, and everything you've heard comes from the parliamentary record from Hansard. But at this point, they hadn't got much farther than driving the first spike of the great railroad. Alexander Mackenzie's Liberal government had only managed to lay about 200 miles of track, and they hadn't even figured a way to get out through the mountains of British Columbia. Now, 7.5 years after John A. Macdonald had brought his national dream before Parliament, there was another election coming up. And if it didn't bring Macdonald back into power, it was quite likely there'd be no Pacific Railway for many years to come. At campaign picnics across the province, John A. lampooned the Liberals.
I'm put in mind of a story told of the famous Dr. Johnson, who went to see a play with his good friend Mr. Boswell. The performance was very bad indeed. So bad, in fact, that when the curtain descended, they booed the actors to a man. Now, Mr. Boswell, instead of booing the actors, gave them his imitation of a cow. Gave them his horse and his goat and his chickens. But none of them had quite the same quality as the cow. Dr. Johnson, sensing that his friend was in danger of making a fool of himself, begged him to desist and said, "My dear fellow, since you cannot manage these latter imitations, why don't you confine yourself to the cow?" Which is what I am tempted to say to Mr. Mackenzie, that he desist from all others, including his imitation of a prime minister, and confine himself to the cow.
Hear, hear.
Which he plays so very well.
Thank you so much for your warm welcome.
Speech!
Oh.
Speech!
I needn't tell you that I can't make a speech. I leave speech making to my husband, who, I'm proud to think, can make very good ones.
Well, as I've said many times, flattery is the statement of an agreeable untruth. A compliment is the statement of an agreeable truth. I thank you, my dear, for your compliments.
John A. Macdonald stayed very much in the background in the Mackenzie years. He was living in Toronto and attending to his law practice. He spoke very rarely in the House of Commons. In fact, a lot of people thought that he would retire from politics after the disaster of the Pacific Scandal. But with a fall election approaching in 1878, Macdonald once again began to excite the imagination of the country with something he called the national policy. Actually, it was just a proposal for a protective tariff, but the Liberals had made protection a dirty word. Mackenzie was a free trader. So Macdonald simply called it Canada for Canadians. It meant tariffs to protect Canadian industry, mining and farming, to protect Canadians from unfair American competition, to prevent the Yankees from profiting by Canadian industry, to stop the flow of Canadians across the American border. Canada for Canadians. Pretty good slogan in a depression-ridden country. But the question was, would it be enough to effect the political resurrection of John A. Macdonald?
John?
Mm-hmm.
I suppose, if we do well, it will mean a move back to Ottawa. Well?
If we do well, we'll have a majority of 60. If badly, a majority of 30.
I rather liked that house we had by the river. Earnscliffe.
The election was held on September 17th, 1878, the first secret ballot in Canadian history. So this time, nobody could count noses or threaten wavering electors. The polls closed at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. By 7, it did not look good for the Tories. Macdonald defeated in Kingston. But by 9, the Liberals were in trouble. Blake defeated. Mackenzie, one of the few to win in Ontario. And by 11, the news was out, an unprecedented landslide for Macdonald's Tories. Agnes Macdonald got her house by the river, Earnscliffe. And her husband got a better parliamentary house than his most optimistic forecast, a majority of 68. There was no problem about his own lost seat. He arranged a by-election in Victoria, and he won it, giving him in the end an even larger majority than Alexander Mackenzie had received after the Pacific Scandal.
Donald, this is a sad day for me.
You should not distress yourself. When I fell in 1874, Alec, I made up my mind then that I must cease to worry and think no more about it.
Aye. But I have not that happy frame of mind.
MacDonald was going to need that happy frame of mind as he began to take on all of Mackenzie's railway headaches. In BC, the Battle of the Routes went on. First, MacDonald announced that his government would support the Butte Inlet route to Vancouver Island, and there was talk of a ferry to carry trains across the Straits of Georgia to get away from all those incredible island-hopping bridges that had been suggested. What else could MacDonald do? This was really the only way he could bring the railroad to the clamoring voters of Victoria, and they were the ones who'd just given him his seat in Parliament. The leading alternate route went through the Fraser Canyon to Burrard Inlet, and it didn't look much better. But it would let Ottawa meet its bargain with British Columbia without having to carry the line all the way to Vancouver Island. And so the new Minister of Railways, Charles Tupper, quietly called for tenders on 127 miles of rail construction, which just happened to be the exact distance from Yale in the Fraser Canyon to Kamloops, farther inland. Finally, the word got out. That would be the route, and Victoria would have to do without its railroad. The new government's railway policy at first was decidedly sluggish. MacDonald's early attempts to involve private capitalists in the project had been disastrous, so he was now trying to build the line as a public work, contract by contract. On the prairie, a mere 200 miles of flimsy line was begun, running west of Winnipeg to nowhere. There was still a great gap on the shield between Thunder Bay and Winnipeg, and no track at all linking Lake Superior with settled Ontario. All MacDonald could do was keep on letting contracts, paying the price of impossible terrain, mile after mile of muskeg and deep, deceptive lakes. There seemed to be a bottom when there was actually no bottom at all. The real bottom was concealed by a heavy layer of silt which those hasty surveys had failed to probe. For instance, at Cross Lake, a terrible place not far from the present site of Kenora, one contractor saw his dreamed-of profits literally swallowed by the lake. 220,000 yards of sand and gravel vanished beneath the waters at a cost of $80,000. And when the contractors weren't battling the soft porridge of the muskegs, they were up against some of the toughest rock in the world. The one really permanent town on the shield was Rat Portage. It would one day become the thriving resort of Kenora, Ontario, but in 1880, it was just a motley collection of shanties and tents that, by one account, seemed to have been laid out on designs made by a colony of muskrats. It was a rowdy, lawless railwayman's town, a place to forget the dangers of the endless blasting. Dynamite had been patented in the year of Confederation, but the explosive most used here on the shield was still nitroglycerin. And this awesomely unstable fluid was carried in 10-gallon tins, a daily gamble with death.
You want this one over there yet?
The new compressed air drills weren't too common yet either, and so the rock was often laboriously chiseled out by hand. And then came the unbelievably risky job of getting the nitro poured into the rock. The number of men killed or maimed by accidental explosions was staggering. In one 50-mile stretch, there were 30 graves, all the result of the careless handling of nitroglycerin. The diaries and the memoirs of the time tell us what happened, and they even tell us the sort of thing that got said.
Yeah, it's a warm day today, Pat.
That's so. Maybe you'll be warmer before you camp tonight.
Aye, I guess you're right to that. Is there any work you want taken for the devil?
Where you bound for, Jack?
Aye, to hell, I guess.
I'll take the other train and save a berth for me, man.
Aye. Is it your coffin you're going to be carrying, Pat?
Faith, you're right. And the coroner's inquest into the bargain.
Aye.
I think we ought to clear away from this car, just in case.
Don't be, Doc. We're far enough away as it is.
Ah, you never know.
Oh, you don't worry, Guts. That's what you are.
Come on.
In the summer of 1880, Rat Portage was probably the roughest town in Canada, with 800 gallons of illicit liquor pouring in every month in spite of the efforts of both the government and the contractors. Liquor also flowed out of Rat Portage and into so-called towns like this one at Hawk Lake. One bloody incident, for which we have a record, had all the elements of a classic Western. It involved two whiskey traders named Harrington and Mitchell. John J. MacDonald was the railway contractor, fearful of what a wagon load of whiskey might do to his workforce. The company constable, Ross, was the man with a warrant for the arrest of Harrington and Mitchell. The contractor and the constable found their quarry in front of Millie Watson's canvas body house.
All right, Harrington. Stop right there.
I got him, Ross.
Can't stop me. You can't stop me, I tell you. Whatever you do, I'll keep on selling the stuff. You bastards.
You're under arrest, Harrington.
Now an extraordinary thing happened. Harrington asked MacDonald and Ross to let him go into Millie's tent to clean up, and amazingly enough, they let him do it.
All right.
Millie was inside with a customer,
Let us your gun.
and the customer was a crony of Harrington's.
Get out! Come on!
Ross was informed he need not bother to fire again. The first bullet had taken effect.
You're damn right it took effect. But I'd rather be shot than fined.
But for the rest of the country, things were looking up. The Depression was over at last. There had been a bumper crop in the fall of 1879, and there was more money and more people able to enjoy the first-class comfort of the Eastern railways. And this change in the economic climate allowed a corresponding change in the Tories' sluggish railway policy. John A. Macdonald had been forced to learn Mackenzie's bitter lesson, that in the middle of a depression, you can't really build a transcontinental railway. And as a matter of fact, given the political conditions of those days, the government couldn't do it either. Now, in the spring of 1880, the Minister of Railways, Charles Tupper, was pushing Macdonald very hard to finish the Pacific Railway. What was needed was a group of capitalists to take over the job. And of course, that's what Macdonald had gone after in the first place, and that result had been disastrous, the Pacific Scandal. So for the sake of the government and the railway, and for the sake of Canada, it would have to be an entirely different story this time. Two streaks of rust and a right-of-way. That's what people called the old St. Paul and Pacific Railroad in Minnesota. It was in such terrible shape that when the receiver in bankruptcy came out in 1873 to take it over, the battered old locomotive wouldn't run the line, and he had to use a handcar. Yet this was the road which was going to make three remarkable Canadians rich beyond their wildest dreams, and what's more, give them the money and the experience to build the Canadian Pacific Railway. One was Donald Smith, Macdonald's old enemy. A frosty man, courtly of manner, unshakable in a crisis, far-sighted too. He predicted the end of the buffalo on the prairie, and he kept a small herd of them at his estate near Winnipeg, which he called Silver Heights. Smith was an old Hudson's Bay Company man. In the early days in Labrador, he had acted as unofficial banker for the trappers, and he'd so shrewdly managed their money that he'd come out with the beginnings of a personal fortune. And now, he was determined to see that fortune grow. One of Smith's partners was his cousin George Stephen, outwardly reserved, publicly reticent, but burning with inner fires, ambition, imagination, and all the passions and doubts of the Scot. His one relaxation was salmon fishing, something he'd learned as a boy in Banffshire. At school, he'd been very good at mathematics. As a young immigrant to Canada, he'd foreseen the shortage of cotton and woolen goods caused by the Crimean War, and he'd cornered the market. That was the first in a series of brilliant financial coups that took George Stephen from draper's assistant to president of the Bank of Montreal. Jim Hill from Rockwood, Ontario, had landed in St. Paul, Minnesota, where he'd got wind of the fortunes to be made from coal and land and railways. Now, with both Canadian and American associates, he had his one good eye firmly fixed on the broken-down old St. Paul and Pacific Railway line. These three entrepreneurs took this decrepit old railway, meandering across the Minnesota plains in the general direction of Manitoba, and they got it running at a profit. And that took foreclosures, takeovers, daredevil bargaining, and I think some chicanery, because they got the Minnesota land laws changed at one point. But it was a gamble that paid off for them. They got a land grant worth $13 million. You see, by controlling the land, or by controlling the company, they control 2.5 million acres of the richest agricultural land in the American Midwest. They would soon, through their stocks, gain another $8 million each, and there was much more to come. They now had their eye on the greatest of all railway adventures, the building of the Canadian Pacific. And now in Ottawa, just when John A. Macdonald was ready to begin the long search for the right private capitalists, word was getting around about the fortunes being made in Minnesota.
Catch them before they invest their profits.
It had already reached MacDonald's friend and cabinet crony, John Henry Pope.
I said, catch them before they invest their profits.
I heard you.
In September, MacDonald made an historic announcement. The Pacific Railway would be built by George Stevens' syndicate. And Stephen wrote to MacDonald, "My friends and enemies agree it will be the ruin of us all." And it almost was.
There can be no argument about it. Your responsibility and the responsibility of your company is to connect Ottawa with the Pacific, with an all-Canadian line, including the route north of Superior.
I'm sorry, Sir John, I must persist. That North Superior line presents an insurmountable problem. It can't be done.
All of the way, Stephen. All of the way or none of the way. I must insist on that. Otherwise...
Very well, sir. We will build north of Superior, and you will grant us an ironclad monopoly in the West.
I beg your pardon.
We will build...
I heard what you said. But what in heaven's name do you mean by an ironclad monopoly?
A guarantee that no other company will be allowed to build south of the CPR.
But I can't do that. I can't do it. No. No. Besides, damn it, I won't.
Sir John, no businessman in his right mind would sink a penny, not a penny, in the whole line west of Winnipeg if he thought for 1 minute that anyone else was going to be allowed to build between our line and the U.S. border. That is a cold, hard fact. If any other company is going to be allowed to draw off our profits, then I don't see the point of our being there.
What you don't seem to realize, Mr. Stephen, are the political implications of what you propose. If you force this issue, if an Eastern company gets a Western monopoly, there'll be no end to the resentment. No end to it. I've had one rebellion out there already. I do not want another. Riel was enough, dear heaven. Do not bring down the CPR in my head in that fashion. The end of it would be the loss of the West, and no, I won't hear of it.
The other way that this might end, Sir John, will be that you lose the whole country. Let me try you on one last fact. Right from the beginning, as you know all too well, this entire railroad scheme has been in danger of strangulation at the hands of the American railroad interests.
Hear, hear.
Right now, right this very minute, they continue to constitute a very real, if not to say an imminent danger. If any other railway, other than the CPR, makes connections with Winnipeg, then every penny we spend east of Winnipeg might just as well be thrown out into the lake.
Yes. Yes, you're right. But mark me, Stephen. We'll pay for this. One way or another, this decision will come back to haunt us. I fear the West will hate us for it forever.
But in the meantime, there will be a railroad.
Aye. All the way.
We know from George Stevens' voluminous and often impassioned correspondence with MacDonald the kind of bargaining that took place before the contract was drawn up. After all, it was the most important document since the British North America Act. This is the document that allowed our country to break out of the prison of the St. Lawrence lowlands. This is the document that gave us, for the first time, an accessible frontier. This is the document that led eventually to the opening of the West. It was costly. Besides the subsidies of land and money, the CPR also got concessions in tax and duty. And the Free Press here in Ottawa estimated that all of that came to something like $261 million. And George Stephen got his monopoly, and that was good for 20 years. As MacDonald had predicted, there was opposition, enormous opposition. Manitoba was up in arms about the monopoly clause. A lot of people thought the government had been far too generous with the railway. And almost everybody was worried about the American influence in what was then called the St. Paul Syndicate. They feared the very thing the CPR was created to prevent, the development of our West and all the profits from it falling into the hands of the hated Yankees. On December the 9th, 1880, Ottawa was deep in the grip of winter. The newspapers were filled with Yuletide advertisements, but the big story was the early opening of Parliament and the coming debate on the CPR contract. Everyone now realized that it would be the most important parliamentary sitting in the history of the young Dominion. While the syndicate had been trying to play down its American connections, the government's chief embarrassment had been Donald Smith. 2 years before, in these chambers, John A. Macdonald had called him the biggest liar in the world. Now he was trying to hand Smith and his friends an enormous slice of Canada, and opposition members, such as Alexander Mackenzie, wanted to know why.
It is therefore of the first importance that this Parliament should have a complete statement of all offers made, to enable us to judge whether this government has received any offers which, in the estimation of this House, would be more favorable to the public interest of the country. I presume there would be no objection to the production of these papers.
Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid that we cannot be of much assistance to the honorable gentleman in this regard. But I would say this, that the present offer is the most favorable offer, both as to land and money, that the government and delegates have received.
You can bet it was the most favorable offer. It was the only offer MacDonald had been left with. And the Tory caucus was appalled by its terms. It had taken Charles Tupper, the Minister of Railways, an entire day to persuade them to back it in the House. But nobody was going to be able to persuade the Liberals to accept this railway bill. They were fighting under a new leader now. A by-election had brought back Edward Blake to take over from the ailing Mackenzie. Round one in the fight would feature Sir Richard Cartwright, the aristocratic Liberal, who was just itching to tear into his old political enemy, Tupper, the Cumberland warhorse.
There is only one basic difference, which is that under the present contract, the people of Canada will get their railway for $30 million less than under the Liberals' Railway Act of 1874. If I have no other bequest to make to my children after me, the proudest legacy I could desire to leave would be the record that I was able to take an active part in the promotion of this great measure, by which I believe Canada will receive the impetus that will make it a great and powerful country at no distant date.
And, Mr. Speaker, although the honourable gentleman told us that it was the proudest moment of his life when he came to lay the measure before us, and although he told us, if I understand him aright, that the fact of his being prominent in conducting the negotiation will enable him to leave a substantial legacy to his children after him.
Shame,
And who knows? Perhaps it may be so.
The honorable gentleman is making a statement which he knows is utterly at variance with what I said. Well, I am astonished that even that honorable gentleman should be willing to so lower himself.
Mr. Speaker, if I am to understand that this is not a substantial legacy, but merely a legacy of fame, then I admit to correction. I am sorry for my mistake. And I am sorry for his children.
On December 21st, the House adjourned for Christmas. But during the holiday, MacDonald and Tupper had to reassure the Tory caucus that the contract would be ratified. Members from all across the country had the strongest doubts. In Halifax, indifference. Why should they pay for what would happen in the distant West? In Quebec, discontent. They'd support the government only if they got railway help in their own province. In Winnipeg, open revolt against the monopoly clause and against exploitation by the industrial East. Only Victoria had a kind word for the syndicate. It seemed that BC might at last get its railway. Meanwhile, the Liberals thought they had another Pacific scandal on their hands. All through the holiday, they dashed about trying to drum up a flood of angry petitions against the government. But only a couple of hundred trickled in, and some of them contained the signatures of corpses. It was clear the people wanted the railway, and they wanted the contract settled. Parliament reconvened on January the 5th, and by the 17th, everybody was waiting for John A. Macdonald to enter the endless debate. Edward Blake's Liberals had devised a final piece of strategy, a hastily put together rival syndicate based in Toronto. It had agreed to take on the job of building the railway at terms that seemed highly attractive. It was all made to sound very businesslike and totally unpolitical. Of course, it was nothing of the sort. When MacDonald rose to attack this last-minute bid on the contract, he knew that Edward Blake would follow him with one of his brilliantly contrived orations. The Prime Minister's health was giving way, but this time he had the country on his side.
Mr. Speaker, I shall offer a few remarks. And they will not be long, on the subject of that communication which was laid before us today and which comes to us from the so-called new syndicate. But before I begin, I want just to repeat a remark I made some time ago, and I said it was my hope to be able by and by to look down upon the Pacific Railway as a fait accompli. I also said I hoped it would be done with the assistance of the honorable members opposite. But the project that has been laid before us today shows that they have abandoned all idea of ever building the Canadian Pacific Railway. By a political plot, They are trying to put off the blame upon others. Yet notwithstanding that plot, notwithstanding the wiles of the opposition and the flimsy arrangement which has been concocted, the road is going to be built and proceeded with vigorously, continuously, systematically, and successfully to a completion under the auspices of a conservative government and with the support of a conservative party, and the fate of Canada as a dominion then will be sealed. Then will the fate of Canada as one great body be fixed beyond the possibility of the honorable members opposite to unsettle. But as long as Mordecai sits at the gate, he will protest. Sir, we have had tragedy, comedy, and farce from the other side. The contract was declared oppressive. We were giving away the whole land of the Northwest. There was to be a monopoly given away to this company. This was the tragedy. The comedy came when the speeches of the honorable gentlemen were read. Each of the honorable gentlemen got up and said, "Oh, it's true, I said that a year ago, or 2 years ago, or whenever, but I'm not bound by it now." Oh, yes, it amused us all. It amused the House. It amused the whole country. Now, sir, the last thing to come is the farce. And the farce we had laid on the table today. It is a farce. Though whether it'll be farcical in its consequences, I cannot say. I may say it's too thin. No man who could say 2 and 2 make 4 could be caught for one moment in this flimsy scheme. It was concocted here. It was concocted in Ottawa. It was concocted as a political engine. I say that that document shows on its face that it was concocted, drawn up here. Now we come to the joker in the pack. I refer to the document on the table. The first clause does away with the Lake Superior section. The second clause provides for a rail line to Sault Ste. Marie and the United States. The third clause provides for the government to abandon the British Columbia section. And the fourth clause gives up building anything west of Jasper House. The whole scheme, then, is nothing more than an impudent offer to build the Prairie section, the paying section, the easiest section, the cheapest section, the most profitable section, and to do so by means of political friends. They would be relieved of running any section of the line that did not pay. And if they connected up with the Yankee railways at the Sioux, it could only be to the utter ruin of the great policy under which the Dominion of Canada was created, and to the utter ruin of our hopes of being a great nation. The colonies would gradually be severed from one another and become a bundle of sticks as they were before, with no binding cord. And then we should fall helpless, powerless, aimless into the hands of the neighboring republic. No. Mr. Speaker, honorable members, I will not have it. What I will have is an arrangement that will satisfy all the loyal, legitimate aspirations.
that will make us a great and united, a rich and improving, developing Canada, instead of becoming a tributary to American bondage, to American tolls, to American freights, to all the little tricks and all the big tricks that American railways are addicted to for the purpose of destroying our road. Look upon that picture, and then on this. And I know which choice will be made by the people of Canada.
Mr. Speaker, I feel deeply impressed with the sense of responsibility which I am sure must weigh upon every independent member of this House who knows that he has a free vote to give, and for that vote will be responsible to his constituents and to his country as to the course he shall take upon this question.
I regret that the Honourable First Minister, who may be said to have introduced the regular debate upon the resolutions of the ministers of railways, should, upon a topic whose...
They were the same arguments Blake had used 10 years before, and they were still just as convincing. It was madness to try to punch a railway through that sea of mountains and across that rocky Precambrian desert. Immigration would not match government predictions, land sales would not pay for it all, and it would be easier and cheaper to go west by way of the United States. But the fight on Parliament Hill was far from over. The Liberals had proposed 24 amendments, some of them the longest ever seen in Canada. By January 27th, the weary members had already had one all-night session when MacDonald gave them a warning. He was going to keep them at it, defeating the Liberal amendments if it took another whole night long.
Mr. Mulligan, Mr. Huntington, Mr. Mackenzie, Mr. Cartwright, Mr. Holt, Mr. Holt.
As the hours dragged by, the voting became a kind of carnival. One member purposely disguised himself so that the House officials failed to recognize him during the roll call on one of the votes.
Order, gentlemen. Monsieur.
I beg your pardon.
Mr. Terry, Monsieur Bersan George, Mr. Cameron Huron, Mr. Gilmore, Mr. Ray, Monsieur de Rossard, Mr. McLean, Mr. Patterson Grant, Mr. Cameron Middlesex.
Night wore on into morning, and the punch-drunk House continued to plunge through the business, too tired to care anymore. When 8 o'clock came, the final amendment had been voted down and the bill was given first reading. And on February 15th, 1881, the Canadian Pacific Railway would receive royal assent. And so the national dream was finally launched. 10 years, almost to the month, since the subject of a Pacific Railway had first been raised in the House. John A. Macdonald was triumphant, but so ill it would take him 6 months to recover. Alexander Mackenzie was a political has-been. Edward Blake was in retreat. Sir Hugh Allen would never live down the Pacific scandal. Sanford Fleming withdrew to England. Moberly quit his profession. Marcus Smith hung on, but in a minor post. The railway had changed and twisted all their futures, as it had Macdonald's, as it would the nation's.
Far out beyond the Red River, the prairie land lay desolate. An army of 12,000 would be marshaled to invade the Northwest, and other armies would follow to the mountains and the Shield. In just 12 months, cities yet unnamed would have their birth. Passes yet uncharted would ring to the sound of axe and sledge. Nothing could ever be the same again. The tight little Canada of Confederation was obsolete. The new Canada of the railway could now begin. At last, the dream was about to become the reality.